Rebuild pivot on a Turfware TR360. Review operator's manual prior to performing repairs. Disconnect the battery before starting any electrical repair. This is an exploded view of the pivot assembly. Start by removing the wiring harness from the starter to give yourself more slack when disassembling the pivot. You do not have to unhook the white wire that goes to the tachometer. You want to support the rear end of the deck because it will fall forward once you detach the back pivot assembly plate. While everything is still tight and stable, clean the bottom of the pivot to expose the cotter pin and working area. Remove the cotter pin with a side cutter. With a 1.5 inch socket, remove the castle nut on the bottom of the pivot. Using a 3/4 socket and impact wrench, remove all 8 carriage bolts on the rear pivot plate, leaving the top left bolt for last. Make sure to set aside the washers and nuts for reassembly. When you get to the last bolt, a second person will be needed to hold the handlebars. When you pull the last bolt out, the person holding the handlebars will keep the front end from falling. With a 9/16 ratchet wrench, remove the bolt and washer holding the pivot pin. With a hammer, lightly tap the pin up and pull it out of the pivot assembly. Pull the detached pivot bracket off. Remove the 2 metal grease rings and 2 bearings. If you need to do a complete pivot replacement because the pin is rusted in place, this is the point at which you should detach the front pivot plate and bolt the new one on. At this point, clean the pivot of all debris and old grease. If you ordered the pivot assembly rebuild kit, it comes with the bearings already packed. If you use your own, make sure to pack the bearings before reassembling. Place the top bearing in the cylinder and place the seal on it with the curve side down. Then place the bottom bearing in the seal with the curve facing up. Make sure the bolt hole is on top and slide the plate back into place. Have the person holding the handlebars tilt the front end forward to help get the pin into the cylinder. Using the hammer, gently tap down and align the bolt hole. Apply blue thread locker to the bolt and tighten with a 9/16 ratchet wrench. Insert the 2 provided alignment bolts in the pivot plate and the rear deck to help you get the plate bolts aligned. Now you can start replacing the carriage bolts, 1/2 inch washers, and lock nuts. Lightly tighten the upper outside bolt to leave some play in order to help get the other bolts in. Make sure the second alignment pin is still in place. Replace the rest of the bolts, washers, and lock nuts. Making sure the alignment pins are seated, start tightening the carriage bolts from the inside to the outside. Using a 3/4 socket and impact wrench, tighten all the carriage bolts. Inside bolts first, then outside bolts. Now you can remove the alignment pins. You may need a wrench to help get them out. You can take the jacks down now. Get the washer and castle nuts started. Check play in handlebars and tighten the castle nut. Repeat this step until there is no play in the pivot. Install the cotter pin. Open the cap on the pivot grease fitting. Fill the pivot with grease until you see grease coming out of the top and bottom of the pivot. Clean away excess grease. Make sure all hoses are tucked back in place and pull the wiring harness back into place so it can be hooked back up to the starter. Now you can reconnect the wiring harness to the starter. Make sure all hoses and wires are free and won't be pinched when the front end turns. Reconnect the battery. Our pivot is designed to last virtually forever if you keep it full of grease. If you look inside the pivot, you would see grease filling the pin cylinder. Gravity during operation causes grease to settle out of the pivot cylinder. It allows moisture and corrosive materials to build up, causing rust and destroying the bearings. If you grease it weekly, this will never happen.